My name is Roger Armstrong. I was born a psychic child in 1930, and I was trained by my imaginary friend guardian in 1933. He taught me how to focus to control the abilities I was starting to show. And this is all part of the sequence of wasapsychicchild.com. Now, this next segment, I want to talk about shields and shielding. Because if you are an indigo child, or if you are susceptible to voices that you hear, you need to be able to control that. And you need to assume or vision a shield for yourself over your head. Now, when I was 3, I was telepathic due to guardians training, some of it, at least to be able to focus my telepathic intention. So I could talk to all the animals on Grandpa's farm, and that's where I spent my summers. And he trained me to do a variety of things to control my psychic abilities. One, he trained me how to control levitating things and to use shields. So they made a formal presentation when they presented me with my helm, finish for a head covering. Grandpa was a Finn. So Grandpa arranged for the field room, the seed room in the barn, to be a presentation for my shield. And he hung birch leaves all around and made a birch leaf garland for my head to start with. And he and Guardian started chanting. And they finished their chant, and Guardian came up, knelt in front of me, and held out this imaginary chainmail helmet that went over my head and went over my shoulders. A Viking helm is what it was. Grandpa removed the little crown of birch leaves, took the helm and placed it on my head and arranged the folds so it was proper. I was amazed at the silence, because I was used to hearing the mental leakings of all the animals and of all the people that came to visit. And so for the first time, I could hear everything. As I focused on it, I could hear everything clearer. So when Nancy the cow was out talking to crows, I could listen in on the conversation. And they talked philosophy. And she talked them into training me to be able to talk to the air as an entity. Yeah, crows are smart. Anyway, then I would practice opening and closing my mind to receive or to stop telepathic energy from coming in. Now, of course, all beings, all animals, all grasses, all trees, all flowers, the wind, all of these are telepathic, and they speak in their own particular frequency. So you tap into that frequency and you can talk to the grass. Now, some of the beings aren't as involved as Nancy the cow was, and talking, and the crows were, and talking philosophy. Most of them have some matter of control. As a matter of course, they can close their mind off to other thoughts. And they aren't words as much. Words end up being clutter. But it's pictures that is telepathically based. Now, it starts before birth. And the fetus senses the energy of the mother. But it's a pictured color. And when other entities enter in with their energy, the fetus gives them a color. So the fetus can tell between dad and the family pet and the goldfish and the trees outside and the birds and mom. All of these have a color reference for the fetus. I was pretty well developed along. Yeah, I was pretty well developed along in controlling all of this. And going through high school, junior high and high school and elementary was good. I spent all the summers out at Grandpa's farm. And when Grandpa was going away somewhere, he'd tell me to go up and to the fairy ring and talk to the animals. And above our watercress spring, there was a fairy ring. Now, our fairy ring is formed by mushrooms that start out as a circle from one spot and over the years get wider and wider and wider. And in the center of this are generally 3 mounds of moss growing on top of itself. And this is where the fairies had their meeting, with the queen standing on the top and all the other fairies around. Now, Grandpa's Woods had a lot of different off-world people, mythological people. And it was fun to go and talk with them. Now, when I went into the Army, I enlisted. I was in college. I'd go to a class and there'd be an empty seat. What happened to John? Oh, he got drafted. Now, when I was with the other kids being drafted so frequently, and my grades weren't that good, so I anticipated being drafted. So I talked to some past lives of friends that I had. One was a Roman centurion, and they all advised me to enlist. And being enlisted, the other not being enlisted, but being a professional army, RA they would call them, a regular army person, the other sergeants would give me preferential treatment because I was one of them, not just a draftee. So the first thing they did was make me a squad leader. And what they did is they sent me in my squad, they called it F squad. What they did was give me all the people that they didn't want. The guys that couldn't read and write. The guy that was 6'5", and the guy that was 5'2". Now you try and get these guys to march together, and you can see the problems that they would have. No. So I met with these guys, and I found they were all from Appalachia. Different parts. Some were from New England, some were from Kentucky and Alabama, but all from the mountain chain. Only 2 of them could read and write. But they lived in a house without electricity. Grandpa's house didn't have electricity right away as a child. You know, they had an outhouse rather than an indoor plumbing. Grandpa had an outhouse and indoor plumbing until 1940. So there was 7 years there that it didn't have it. So we had a bond of experience. I didn't laugh at them and call them hillbillies because they couldn't read or write. And we found that they were naturally telepathic because they would hunt animals and they could tell where the animals were as part of their natural survival. Interesting. Okay, so during Army lectures, I would teach them how to read and write. Now, they couldn't do cursive, but they could print. So when it came to get their paycheck, the sergeant would say, just make your X and I'll write your name. But once they learned to read and write, and that only took them like 2 weeks. So the next payday, the sergeant said, just make your X and I'll write your name in. They said, no need to, Sarge. And they'd print their name. And the sergeant said, I thought you couldn't read or write. And the guy would look at them and look at the sergeant and say, Sarge, we was just funning with you. And they'd feel so good about that because he was calling them, you know, ignorant hillbillies and all that kind of stuff. Now, because of their psychic abilities and because of their wood lore and their natural growing up, wrestling primarily, and some boxing. We had one guy, Farmer. He was 5'3", but he was a Golden Gloves ultra lightweight. And I saw him take down a 6-foot plus 200-pound guy because he knew how to do it. Anyway. So and to solve the marching problem, we double timed everywhere. Now, when you double time, you take short steps. So everybody could do short steps. See? Slim, the tall guy, he could take short steps. Farmer, the little guy, he could take larger short steps, but they could still look like a unit. And since we double timed everywhere, everybody noticed it, and they liked that. Yeah? They were an interesting group of men. When it came to field exercises, they couldn't be beat. And they would set traps. They would set traps. The cadre would set traps for them, and they just go around the traps. And we had the notion that it would be fun to sneak behind the cadre as they're in their positions, drop a rock on their helmet, a small rock on their helmet, and say, "Boo, you're dead," without them realizing we were there. So we became known as the Ghost Squad. One of the things that I taught them how to do was to shield themselves. So they became, energy-wise, they became invisible. Now, that's just mental shielding. One of the men in the barracks became a friend of mine that was not in my squad, and his name was Robert Knop, K-N-O-P, like the publisher. And I would hypnotize him, and we would do all kinds of hypnotic exercises in gambling and all that kind of stuff. But he also learned on his own to shield himself physically. And that's the first time I ever ran across that. He was afraid of needles. And so when the Army came to give him shots, he didn't like it. So he would shield himself so his skin was like iron or steel, and a needle couldn't penetrate it. It would slide off. I'd be behind him in line. I'd make sure I was with him to get our shots, and I would lean forward and whisper in his ear, and I'd say, "Take the shield off your right arm." And he would do that. He'd say, "Okay," and then he'd get his shots. We went to give blood, and I was in the gurney next to him. And the gal came in to take his blood, and he saw the needle and shielded. And she couldn't get the needle in the arm. She tried and tried, but she just couldn't do it. And she finally started to jab. And I said, "No, why don't you go get your supervisor?" So she went to get her supervisor, and I told Knopper to release and not have his right arm shielded. And supervisor came in, stuck the needle in, and said, "I don't know why you had any problem." And Knopper and I sent that, we got the woman's name that did the jabbing, and we sent her some flowers afterward as a thank you. You know, it's a sorry thing. Now, when I went into combat, I was a forward observer with the Thai troops. Now, the Thais are universally Buddhists. So, having miraculous things take place was not unusual. For the complete story about the Thais and my shielding them in combat, refer to the video in wasapsychicchild.com called Buddha's Umbrella. When I went into combat, Guardian insisted that I have a 5-layer commander shield. And I have it to this day. It protects me from mental assaults, as well as any physical assaults. Now, in Chicago, there was a woman who was a psychologist and who dealt with indigo children. Now, indigo children are children who are telepathic, like I was in the very beginning, very young. And she trains them to connect with other people, which is good. And she gives each one of them a picture and a style of a shielding hood that they would like to wear. So they select it, she bestows it upon them, and they're amazed at the silence. And then as to have them touch each other, and feel the other person's energy, then that makes a mental connection so they can connect telepathically with each other. The whole group can take turns. Now, when you are telepathic, you have a signature that you use. My signature is Roger. And that's Old English for famous with a spear. And my image is an animated clip of a spear piercing a mental shield to the point of going 1/3 of its wooden shaft. So when I'm talking with people off-world or people that are telepathic in the United States, why, I start my video, I start my transmission and end my transition with my icon. So. Now again, I like to refer to this as being an application of a focused intention. And like all my videos that I do, it's protected with a PIA, protective intention attached. This is Roger Armstrong. I was a psychic child, born in 1930, and trained by my friend, who was my initial imaginary friend, guardian. And it's part of the video series as wasapsychicchild.com.